Hello, my name is Isaac Nellist, and welcome to the latest episode of the Green Left Show. Now, I've got a really interesting interview coming up with Paul Murphy, who is a member of People Before Profit in Ireland, and he was heavily involved in the Catherine Connolly campaign for president, which she won in a historic victory for the left. And this is while standing on a pro-Palestine, anti-militarism, pro-housing campaign, and up against the strength of the, political and media establishment. So Paul is going to be going into sort of how Catherine's campaign was so successful and how it actually brought the left together behind the campaign as well. We'll also touch on Paul's take on the election of Zoran Mamdani in New York as the mayor of New York, and how, what parallels and links there are between these two important left victories, and what lessons can we take for our campaigns here in Australia and in other parts of the world. But before we get started with that, I'd just like to mention that I am recording this episode on stolen land, on the land of the Gadigal people. This land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And Green Left pledges to stand with First Nations people in campaigns for justice, sovereignty and land rights. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'll also mention before we get started that if you're not already, please consider becoming a Green Left supporter. It's the best way to both receive our work and to help us continue doing it. The show, the Green Left newspaper, our other podcasts and social media, etc., keeping coverage of all the protests here in Australia and the international political news around the world. We are a people-powered project and rely entirely on your support to continue. We don't receive any corporate donations or advertising, so please consider becoming a supporter. It's only $5 a month to sign up. Head to greenleft.org.au/support. So I started by asking Paul to give us some of the political context behind the Catherine Connolly campaign and why it was so successful.
Yeah, I mean the backdrop is definitely important and is an important context as to why Catherine's victory is so important. Because just to be clear at the outset, in case people have the wrong idea, they hear president and they think, this is a powerful figure like Donald Trump or like in France or whatever. Like our presidential position is largely ceremonial. It's a position of giving speeches. You have a particular constitutional role around like being basically the final signature on legislation, but you don't just have discretion to say, I disagree with this neoliberal piece of legislation, I am not going to sign it. You don't have that discretion. Your only job in terms of legislation is to say, is this constitutional? And if I feel it's not constitutional, then there's various things that I can do. But again, they're quite limited. So mostly it is, a ceremonial role, but its importance as a big victory doesn't come from the power of the position itself, but rather the context that we've been in. So in Ireland, historically, you have two centre-right traditional parties of the political establishment, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They have, for the entire history of the Irish state of over 100 years, they have ruled Ireland. In general, up until the government before last, they always ruled one or the other. And if you go back to the 1980s or whatever, they had between them close to 80% of the vote. And they were on a kind of slow secular decline, which was then massively accelerated by the economic crisis. There was a real dynamic towards the left. In that context, then, over the last couple of government terms, so from we had an election last year, which saw them re-elected together in a coalition, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael. They were in coalition from 2020. Before that, in 2016, they had what was known as a confidence and supply arrangement, which was a step towards coalition, whereby one, Fianna Fáil was strictly speaking in the opposition benches, but agreed to vote for budgets, vote confidence in ministers, and so on. So, the traditional political establishment is losing their grip on things here. But by coming together, which they'd never done up until then, they always presented themselves as opponents, even though they're almost identical and have been almost identical on nearly every question of policy. So that was a reflection in the sense of their weakness, but also they were able to stop the change that many people wanted to see. Um, and another important context is that the pendulum in Ireland, like in most countries, was generally swinging leftwards from kind of 2014 onwards in the aftermath of the crisis, with major social movements, in particular on the water charges. We defeated this attempt to impose charging for water and then commodification and privatization with a huge mass movement, 73% of people refusing to pay, repeated mass demonstrations, like grassroots organizing. We then won on a series of important issues of oppression. We won on abortion rights. So we got rid of, there was a constitutional ban on any form of abortion, and we won effectively the right to choose, with some limitations, which we're still pushing for, but relative to most countries and relative to where we'd come from, and a country dominated by the Catholic Church and so on, big victory. We won same-sex marriage equality. I think we were the first country to win that by a referendum. So the pendulum was definitely swinging to the left. There was a rise of kind of socialist left forces like People Before Profit, which I'm a TD or an MP for. And behind Sinn Féin as the kind of main expression of that. But effectively, over the past number of years, that pendulum has swung back away to the right, with the decline of struggles, social movements, energy to the left, the emergence of an anti-immigrant sentiment, big anti-immigrant protests, the emergence of a far right, which doesn't have an organized national parliamentary expression. It does have some councillors, like openly fascist local councillors elected, but also has real sympathy and voices in the parliament from some small right populist forces as well. So just things have become much more complicated. And whereas, for example, in 2020, people would have seen, oh, we may have a chance of electing the first left-wing government. We could beat Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael. By the time of 2024, the last general election, heads were more down. There was a local election, which was very poor, in particular for Sinn Féin, where Sinn Féin played into a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, centred that issue, declined as a consequence. So things have been challenging. For example, in 2024, People Before Profit Solidarity, which is the kind of radical left alliance in the Dáil, we went from, what did we have? We had 5 seats between us to 3 seats. So, not a disaster, but a setback. And that kind of reflects the general mood. And in general, things have been difficult, with the exception of a mass ongoing movement on Palestine, huge solidarity, having a big impact. But this is the first time you kind of have an electoral expression of that. We win a majority. It's the first time the left has won a majority of votes. So there have been left-wing presidents previously, but never elected on more than 50%, whereas Catherine got more than 63% of the vote in first preference, biggest number of votes total that any presidential candidate has ever got, the biggest percentage vote, the biggest margin of victory. So in a sense, seemingly out of nowhere, we have this big electoral victory for the left, which raises people's sights, gives people's hope that, oh, could we also have a governmental change? Can we have major social movements again on a range of issues? Yeah.
What were some of the key issues that Catherine Connolly campaigned on in this election?
Yeah. So you won't find, for example, if you went on Catherine Connolly's website, you won't find a list of policies, because it's not that sort of election. But what you will find is a list of values and key issues. And to pick out some of the key ones, neutrality, so anti-militarism. There's a big attempt to undermine what is left of Ireland's traditional military neutrality and to line Ireland up with Western imperialism to get Ireland close to joining NATO. They've effectively redefined neutrality as everything short of joining NATO. So neutrality was the key issue, more biggest issue than any others. Gaza and the Irish government's complicity in the genocide in Gaza. Obviously, the Irish government's complicity is less than that of the British government or the US government or presumably the Australian government. There's no active support in terms of sending support, sending weapons to Israel, but we are still complicit in the sense of allowing weapons to fly through our airspace, in the sense of refusing to take action to impose any sanctions on Israel, in the sense of, up until recently, the Irish Central Bank was the space where Israeli war bonds were authorized to be sold right across the European Union. And these were openly declared, we're raising this money to use it for this genocide. Obviously, they don't call it, the Israelis don't call it a genocide. And so on that issue, the political establishment and the presidential candidates of the establishment say, no, it's terrible. We're utterly appalled at what's happening. But they're against any meaningful action because that will cause them trouble with US imperialism. Probably the third issue is the issue of housing. We've an immense housing crisis in Ireland. It's been deepening and deepening for close to 15 years now. If you go back, for example, to the 2016 general election, at that stage, we'd left less than 5,000 people in emergency accommodation, so homeless. Now that's well over 15,000, over 16,000 now. So it's tripled in the space of 8 years. Rents have tripled in the space of 10 years. House prices have soared. And, there's people getting enormously rich off this. The big corporate landlords, the big private developers, and they're fundamentally who Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael represent. So, again, it's not a kind of traditional presidential issue, but speaking about housing, the failures of the government, fundamentally the right of people to have a home coming before the right of corporations, of landlords to profit. Other key issues, disability justice. There has been a movement on disability justice. So the main candidate of the establishment was Heather Humphreys of Fine Gael. She was previously a minister. When she was a minister, she tried to implement a reform of disability payments, which effectively would introduce a kind of I. Daniel Blake style assessments of capacity to work, try and put pressure on people to go back to work. And if we say you're able to work, even if you say you're not, we'll cut your payments. And in general, like, disability has emerged as a very, very big political issue. It was a big political issue in 2024, and there's a movement around it. And then the final issue probably is, or the final, if you list the top five, is the issue of the Irish language. So there was a revival of interest in, enthusiasm for the Irish language. And it really took off as an important issue in the campaign. They tried to portray Catherine, and they tried to portray people who speak Irish as like, oh, you look down on the rest of us for not speaking Irish. I don't speak Irish fluently. The majority of people, the big majority, don't speak Irish fluently. But that wasn't Catherine's approach at all. Like, what was interesting is Catherine learned Irish in her 40s and now speaks it fluently, and Irish will be the working language of the presidency. But what it's about, like, there's a movement. There was a big protest during the election, 30,000 people demanding Irish language rights, both north and south, but there's slightly different issues, north and south of the border. But what fundamentally it's about is it's about Ireland's position in the world. Are we just going to become part of the global north, part of the kind of imperialist core, or does our tradition of colonialism, of like being colonized, of British imperialism, of struggle against those, does that have a value? And like Catherine, like I was at loads of events with Catherine, and she spoke really interestingly about, and it's like, if you read degrowth literature, there's a lot of reference to Indigenous people and Indigenous cultures, and how, like, our understanding of nature of Indigenous people is very fundamentally different than Western capitalist society. And Catherine effectively was making the same points about the Irish language, that there isn't this false dichotomy between humanity and nature within the Irish language, and like understanding the language, speaking the language gives you an insight into the problems that we have. And it was really interesting that, like, in a way, there's a point that might seem to be a bit obscure or whatever, but it really resonated with people. So yeah, that emerged, and there's another context to that again, which is like, if you drive through or cycle through any working class, well, any more hard pressed working class community now, you will see Irish tricolours flying, and unfortunately, they're flying as an expression of anti-immigrant sentiment, put up mostly by a conscious campaign of a small number of far right agitators, but also some some people who aren't fully signed up to the far right but have fallen into that trap, and that's very new. So traditionally, if you saw a tricolour, what it would mean was not, it was not something that you had any, and it was any expression of far rightness, it was an expression of Republican movement or a sporting thing. There was no association. Whereas now there's an attempt by the far right to take our flag and to say, to use it like the St. George's Cross is used in England, or the Australian flag presumably is used as an expression of a narrow vision of what it is to be Irish, to be white Irish, not to be a traveller in Ireland, which is an ethnic minority in Ireland, not to be a person of colour, not to be an immigrant. And so, like, the Irish language revival is also part of a kind of contestation of that, and to say, no, there's a different vision of what it is to be Irish, which is to be in solidarity with Palestine, to be in opposition to imperialism, and to be welcoming and open. So it's also kind of, and I think, again, while like there was no far right candidate on the ballot paper, they tried to get a kind of populist right on the ballot paper and missed out. And so, in a sense, the issues of racism and immigration played less of a central, explicit role in the campaign. They were sitting there in the backdrop. There was questions, and Catherine was very explicit. So there's a slogan saying Ireland is full, and Catherine was just unambiguous. Ireland is not full. Whereas the political establishment, and even more so since the election, have been leaning into this far right rhetoric. So it's incredible. You've had this candidate elected on a clear anti-racist platform, and their response has been to ramp up the rhetoric about with too much migration and so on, in an attempt to divert people's attention from the government to the most vulnerable people in our society, asylum seekers.
One of the inspiring things about this campaign was how it united a variety of left groups behind Catherine Connolly, and that obviously had an impact on its success. So I asked Paul to give us a bit of information on how this process came together, how all these various parties decided to work together and support the Catherine Connolly presidential run, and what kind of will this lead to in the future?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's certainly, if not the most important aspect of the campaign, one of the most important in terms of the ramifications for the future. So just, I mean, to situate Catherine politically for those who don't know her, Catherine would describe herself as a socialist. Catherine wouldn't describe herself, and I don't think is a revolutionary socialist or a Marxist. She would, like, in a political spectrum in Ireland, she would sit somewhere between the radical left of People Before Profit and the Social Democrats, who are effectively a marginally left split from the Labour Party, very marginally. And like, it was interesting. Commentators at the start of the campaign were saying, look, this is a woman whose politics align closer with People for Profit than anyone else, which is true. People for Profit in opinion polls and in elections, we're at 3%. 3%, but like, you have to win 50% or like close to that to win the presidential election. So there was an attempt to talk her down. And it also meant that in terms of the prospect of there being a joint left candidate, she wouldn't necessarily be the preferred choice of all of the forces who are to our right. So how did it emerge that she became the candidate? I mean, one thing, like, we and People for Profit have been pushing, certainly from 2020, for the idea of the left standing together. There's an historic issue in Ireland of left parties or progressive parties going into coalition with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, the two establishment, clearly capitalist parties. So the Labour Party historically would rise in support and opposition and then go into coalition and prop up mostly Fine Gael in government. And then the Green Party has done that twice in its existence. Went into government at the time of the crash, just before the crash, then was absolutely wiped out, then was resurrected on the basis of Fridays for Future, the international wave. They're the beneficiaries because they're the ones who are the Green Party. Then they go into government between 2020 and 2024. They're smashed. They're returned with one TD. So we've always called for other parties to rule out coalition with Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and to commit to a left government, and then to have transfer pacts and so on in our electoral system. You vote, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order of preference. So you can advocate, please vote for us, number one, and vote for number two, this party, and so on. And in general, that all got, like, other parties generally weren't very interested in it because they wanted to leave their options open of going in with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. In particular, Sinn Féin, who are the biggest party of the opposition by a long shot, generally poll. At some stages in the course of the last Dáil between 2020 and 24, were polling up in the 30s, but then ended up coming in early 20s, and it collapsed a lot lower than that when the immigration issue got really ramped up, and they kind of fell for it. But they in particular weren't particularly interested. So the 2024 general election proved very difficult for them. In the final day or two of the election, what was interesting was that we had been calling for transfers for other left parties the whole way through. And in the final day or two, Sinn Féin, who knew they weren't doing well and they weren't able to present a coherent alternative, they weren't able to present themselves really as going to be part of an alternative government because Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were in coalition, were clearly going to go back into coalition together. They had the numbers. There was no reason that Fianna Fáil was going to shift from Fine Gael to go in with Sinn Féin. So in the final couple of days, they said, oh, people should transfer to ourselves and the Social Democrats, which was interesting. And then you had the election result, which was disappointing for the left. I think in particular in Sinn Féin, there was a process of reflection after that. And there's an interesting article by an internal figure, which basically raises the prospect, oh, do we need to be part of a kind of broad progressive left platform? So they were more open than previously. Like, so there's a big example. This is an example of like a small cog of revolutionary socialists turning much bigger wheels. But like the wheels also kind of need to be willing to be turned, or at least open to being turned. And so in this case, Sinn Féin definitely was. So, I mean, and then the actual dynamics of it, like we decided early that Catherine Connolly would be the strongest candidate. There were meetings going on, which I was attending for us for a period of 6 months, maybe, discussing all the left-ish parties after the last general election, discussing the presidential election, seeing could we emerge with a candidate. They weren't really, they were fine, they were useful to have. They weren't ultimately going very far. Things were left as, oh, we'll take our time and so on. And then, I mean, we had discussed with Catherine Connolly, we had decided ourselves. Social Democrats, in fairness to them, came to a similar position that Catherine Connolly needs to be the candidate. And between us and the Social Democrats, so to get someone nominated for president, you need 20 TDs, MPs, or senators to sign a nomination form. And between us and them, we would have very close to 20. And we'd very obviously be able to get other left independents. So them and us decided Catherine Connolly could be a good candidate. We then went to the meeting at a certain point and we said, look, we're going to support Catherine Connolly. We encouraged the others to support Catherine Connolly. Catherine Connolly went public saying she's running, and effectively created a dynamic whereby others were put under pressure to support. So then the Labour Party, Catherine Connolly was previously a member of the Labour Party, left. There was like a reasonable amount of bad blood. They were not enthusiastic. There were some senior members. In fairness, the leadership of the Labour Party did genuinely support her, got stuck in, but there was a lot of leading members who were, in particular, one leading member, an MP, who was out all the time in the media, used to criticize Catherine Connolly. He's going to voted for the right wing, Heather Humphreys candidate in the election. The Greens came on board. Sinn Féin took their time. Were considering clearly running their own candidate, which historically they would normally do. But their presidential candidates have always done badly. They also saw the groundswell of support coming behind Catherine. They saw the support that she had, came under public pressure, but then made the right decision to support Catherine. And there's been kind of attempts after the election. Every party, we haven't really engaged in it. Every party eager to say we were the ones that made the difference, But like the truth is, every party, Sinn Féin coming on board, even though they came on board late, like that was important. That was the biggest opposition party. They brought resources, they brought know-how in terms of that scale of a campaign, and they knowledge in terms of like how to deal with smear campaigns, because they are always subject to smear campaigns as the main leftish opposition party. And so basically then it was a mixture of at the top negotiations, and then going public, and then pressure from below to get all the parties on board, and then obviously lots of independents.
Now, the political and media establishment were strongly opposed to Connolly. Obviously, she's standing for pro-Palestine against militarism, for housing, as you've described. But there's a quote that you included in an article that you've written about the campaign from political commentator Ivan Yates, who said that if he was, campaigning against Connolly, he would try to smear the bejesus out of her. So, what can you tell us about this pushback from the establishment, and how effective was it?
Yeah, I mean, the Spear campaign was pretty incredible. It was unrelenting. Every day, basically front page newspapers making, trying to make Catherine look bad. And in a way, it was interesting. And I think the establishment may have made a mistake here because this is not a position that is ultimately, it doesn't ultimately have any power. And yet they really threw everything at it. And I think the danger for them is that they've undermined themselves. They undermined the credibility of the media or large sections of the media and their ability to do the same again in the next general election. I mean, it won't stop them, and it does have an impact, and there is a difference. Like, one of the reasons the smears had less of an impact is, scaremongering about Catherine Connolly. Basically, the implication is we'll lose loads of jobs. US multinationals will pull out of the country. It doesn't have much teeth for two reasons. One, because our current president is someone who also comes from a kind of left of Labour Party tradition, and actually has been, particularly he's had two 7-year terms in the last 7 years, has been very outspoken in terms of Gaza, on the housing crisis, in defense of neutrality, and like the sun hasn't fallen down, and two, because of the nature of the presidency, people know, like, it definitely helped us in this campaign that it was the presidency. It's kind of a values-based election where people get to vote for what they're actually in favor of, what they want to see, as opposed to on the basis of fear of, oh, if I do this thing that I want to do, but they're telling me that if I do, we could lose jobs, and maybe I could lose my job, and so the fear just has less of a bite. But nonetheless, they really went for it. So they started initially. I actually went back and read an early article I wrote about the campaign, and it was funny. Initially, they basically they had a whole load of articles and media pieces about the presidential elections, effectively ignoring Catherine Connolly, even though she was the only candidate who at that stage had enough nominations to be in the race. But then they turned when she became very clearly a credible candidate, a front runner, to an array of smears. So the thing with Ivan Yates, and that became, like, in 20 years' time, that phrase is going to be famous in Ireland. It is now like entered the political lexicon. What was significant about that is Ivan Yates is a former Fine Gael TD of this same party as Heather Humphreys, former minister. And it wasn't that he was saying that this is what they're doing. It was his advice for what they should do on his podcast. He says, if it was up to me, I would, if I'm advising Fine Gael, I'd say you should smear the bejesus out of her. You should say there's going to be a Russian asset in the Oris, a provo, as in a member of the Provisional IRA, in the park, and this kind of thing. And it was. I mean, it annoyed the Fine Gael, no question. That we were able to use this to expose, like, this is what's going on, and it resonated with people. Like, it's funny. There's an early engagement early in the campaign of me and the media, at a kind of press event, talking about a smear campaign, and this went super viral because one particular outlet was caught out in a blatant lie in their piece, and they just denied it, and we went back and forth, and they just denied the lie. Like, so the lie was, there was a journalist into the biggest circulation newspaper in Ireland had written a piece saying that video evidence shows that when Zelensky addressed the Irish Parliament, Catherine Connolly didn't applaud. And then they include a quote from her saying, I did applaud. But they just said the video evidence says that she didn't, And they don't just go and check the video evidence, but just to show that she did. I mean, I didn't applaud. It's not, but the question is, like, what's factually accurate? Is it accurate to say she, and they just stood over this, like, blatant lie. And, like, but so it was already out there, the sense of people that, Jesus, they're not being very fair to Catherine Connolly, And then Ivan Yates comes out and it says, this is the advice that I would give, and it kind of exposes the whole thing. What's ironic, actually, since then, is that there is there's a new controversy around Ivan Yates, which is that, so Fine Gael at the time said, look, this guy's not advising us. We're not taking this, nothing to do with us. But it actually has emerged that he was on the payroll of the other establishment party, Fianna Fáil. They had paid him to train their candidate in the presidential election and then earlier in the general election. The kind of smears, I mean, so like all sorts of kind of random stuff was thrown at her, but the kind of red thread of the main line of smears was to say basically that Catherine is not to be trusted in terms of this state and is not in line with our quote unquote allies. Heather Humphreys talked about our allies. She refused to criticize the US for its arming, funding, supporting of Israel's genocide. Just refused, point blank. Again, oh no, our allies are very important. And this is basically the idea was that Catherine is going to undermine our standing with our so-called allies of Western imperialism. So some of those smears, the smear. So they, I mean, Catherine Connolly like criticized France in one particular speech, which they dug out, France, Britain, and the US, and said she doesn't trust them. This was presented as like a horrendous thing to do. Like, how could you not trust them? And like, what was very strong, and through all of these things, and it was one of the reasons I always thought Catherine would be a strong candidate, is she didn't budge an inch. And I mean, you couldn't understand it because like pretty much all the parties, apart from us, when confronted with some supposed scandal, they backtrack, apologize. You know, like even Jeremy Corbyn, when confronted with an artificial scandal around anti-Semitism, retreated, gave them more. You know, they just keep going. It doesn't work to retreat. Catherine Connolly didn't give an inch on any of these things, so she just would repeat her points. Later on, then she criticized the rearmament of Europe and said there's parallels, including what happened in some parallels with Germany in the run up to World War II. And she was accused of comparing the current German government to the Nazis. Like she didn't say, she never used the word Nazi. That was not, she was making a point about world rearmament and how dangerous it is for the world. But again, this was like massively scandalized. Um, Another one is she was presented, as we all are, as being in some way soft on Vladimir Putin, in some way not opposed to the invasion of Ukraine. Just again and again, like at every interview, it was very funny because I obviously listened to pretty much all the debates. But at every debate, Heather Humphreys would say, I've never heard you condemn Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And Catherine Connolly would say, no, no, I have. I'm condemning it here again. I have a long record of condemning it. Do you know what I mean? And she'd been in interview after interview where she heard her and she would keep saying, I've never heard you say it. This is not true. But again, presented as being in some way soft on Putin. That was given a particular edge that Catherine Connolly had been on a visit to Syria and she was presented as being in some way soft on Assad. Again, she had a record of opposing Assad's dictatorship in advance of her trip. It was a trip to visit Palestinian refugee camps. Then they dug out photos of like, you know, some particular. I mean, the photos is funny because the way in the media queries, it was as if she was like hugging these people. You know what I mean? That like she was very in these pictures. You know, people who had been, you know, linked to various terrorist events or whatever. I can't remember all the details, but people who had done bad things, right? So like she's in photos with these people. Sure, the photos they came out in the papers, and it's like, oh, that's the photo. Just like a picture of 20 people, and Catherine's one of them, and this person, and then like you're on a trip to Syria, which is a dictatorship. You don't have control who is in your space. You know, maybe the biggest two smears they used. I mean, you could go on literally all day, but it was an interesting one actually, because again, I think it really backfired on the establishment. Is they made a big deal out of Catherine employing someone who had been in a kind of radical Republican group. She'd employed them in the Dáil after she had been convicted and served prison time for an attempted robbery of guns. And they tried to make out that this is kind of security risks in the parliament. And it was clear that some of this stuff was coming from the state itself, it was coming from senior members of the police. But Catherine had done everything correctly. When you work in the Dáil, you start working, you get signed in by the TD, has to sign you into the parliament until you have your clearance. You apply for the clearance then. And the clearance never arrived. It took a long, long time, and Catherine was continuing to sign this person in. She was never told not to. She was never told this person was a security risk, anything like this. But it was made out that there was something crazy going on. Excuse me. And yeah, they tried to make, basically it was an opportunity to say the words guns, robbery, what was found in the car. What was she going to use the guns for, Catherine? What was she going to use the guns for? And Catherine, like, she could have thrown this woman under the bus, and condemned her. So, I didn't know anything about that or whatever. But she just stuck to her guns. She said, we have a criminal justice system. Um, I believe in people being rehabilitated. I stand over prisoner rehabilitation. There's been plenty of people in the Irish Parliament in the past who've been convicted of gun offences. Um, what's the problem here? Someone was convicted of a crime. I oppose that crime. They do their time. They're entitled to work, and this person is an upstanding citizen and is contributing to society. And how dare you drag her name through the mud? And it was powerful. And I think again, like the word that the media and people began to use to describe Catherine is authentic. And what I think got reflected is like she actually said what she thought. She just didn't give in. And then the kind of final big attack that they went on, they did an attack ad, very US Trump style, um, attacking Catherine over the fact Catherine was previously a barrister, and as a barrister worked for banks in repossession of people's homes cases. Um, and they tried to make a big deal out of this when, like, in the Irish legal system, if you're a barrister, you cannot deny, you cannot refuse work on the basis of politics. You have to work for both, for example, the prosecution and the defense if you're involved in criminal stuff, or if you're specialized in home repossession. I don't think she specialized in it, but she was involved in it. You have to work for both sides. And like it was deeply cynical because sure, this is the government, like Fine Gael were involved in and Fianna Fáil in particular, in the policies which saw a lot of people having their homes repossessed. Catherine Connolly, I think 7 times in the Dáil voted for a ban on evictions when Heather Humphreys voted every time against a ban on evictions. And so they're trying to smear her in this way. And I think that was a voter suppression tactic that wasn't really aimed at winning people over to vote for their candidate. It was about turning away working class voters. Don't bother going out to vote for Catherine Connolly or go out and spoil your vote. But I think that backfired for them quite badly because this came after the smear the bejesus comment. They're saying, "Oh no, we're not doing it," and then they have this awful attack ad whereby, and then an interview in the main news, this Sunday Independent, the main newspaper, our highest circulation newspaper, with Heather Humphreys suggesting that Catherine Connolly profited from people's misery. Just really disgusting stuff. I mean, there was loads more smears than that, just on loads of stuff. It was like the guy who's the press officer for People for Profit was working as the press officer for the campaign, and he says it was just like nonstop, just the inbox of the press campaign, just boom, boom, boom. And there was someone who was a former journalist who did a little bit of consulting work for our campaign, kind of progressive, who still will be friends with lots of existing journalists. And she said, like, basically the journalists were getting, I think one of them got 40 texts or WhatsApps in a day from Fine Gael with attack lines against Catherine Connolly. Like, it was just nonstop. But it didn't work at all.
Now, there's been another very high-profile win for the left in recent weeks, and that was the election of Zoran Mandani, who is a self-described democratic socialist, winning as the mayor of New York City, and he's going to be inaugurated in January. But I think the Mamdani win and the Catherine Connolly win, both kind of international successes for the left that we're kind of looking at to see if that can be replicated here in Australia or around the world. So I just wanted to hear your take on the Mamdani win and what kind of similarities and differences do you think there are between the Mamdani campaign and the Catherine Connolly campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the same international process. And like when I'm motivated at a People for Profit national meeting, I'm motivated and put forward a motion, that we should, on behalf of the steering committee, we should get stuck into this presidential campaign. And it wasn't automatic that we do that because of the nature of the position, really. But one of the main arguments I made is that, look, in general, the political pendulum is swinging to the right. And I think that's still the case. We shouldn't fool ourselves because of Catherine Connolly and Zoran Mamdani. But there are there is the emergence of powerful countercurrents to that now, of people who see with horror the way the world is going, the fact that the arguments of the far right in terms of immigrants, but also in terms of climate, are being taken up by the political establishment, being normalized. The whole world is absolutely abandoning any commitment to avoid ecological catastrophe. The whole political establishment is engaged in disgusting scapegoating of the most vulnerable people, attacks on trans people. There's something awful happening that people can sense, and that is propelling a layer of people to the left in reaction to that. And the example I gave, the three kind of international context things that I gave at the time, this is like whatever, 6 months ago or less, for People for Profit, because at that time Zoran had won or was in the process of winning the primary. Was Zoran was the result for Die Linke in Germany, which is on the basis of taking, in contrast to pretty much all the political parties, a hard line against the far right, and the energy around your party in Britain, which is now also energy around the Green Party to some degree in Britain. And I think now you can definitely add Catherine Connolly to the mix of that international picture of a countercurrent. I think it's real. Like I said, I don't think we should mistake it as like the overall pendulum is swinging back to the left, because I don't really think that's the case. But there are big countercurrents that the left can connect to, can ride, can have victories linked, and hopefully build substantial left organizations from. I think an area where it's from a distance, in terms of Mamdani campaign, I think we're having a public meeting shortly, and we'll be speaking to people from New York about it. Is definitely the scale of the number of people who got involved in Mamdani was obviously much higher, even taking into account population differences, whatever. Although it's actually, Mamdani I think got just over the first one to get over 1 million votes. Catherine Connolly got close to 1 million votes. So you're probably dealing with similar enough groups of people. So that was like it was Catherine Connolly's campaign was a movement. She described it as a movement repeatedly. She said it's not about me. I'm a symbol. This is a movement. It's 16,000 people volunteered, but more than 16,000. About half of those actually did do something in the real world in terms of either donating or actually getting involved. And there was, a kind of ground game in our campaign, which isn't normal in a presidential election. It's normally all airwaves. Like I don't think the other side did much at all. Whereas we had serious canvassing operations right across the country with the left parties working together with new people coming in. It was very positive, but not, I think, on the scale of movement that you've seen in New York. And I think definitely some of that is the nature of the campaign. If this was a campaign for a left government, it is a different picture. It's higher stakes. It's more to be won. But like, what's interesting, and it's like there's a plus and a negative here, because I think it's the same in terms of Die Linke. You get this impression it's the same in terms of Britain. Is like the dynamic force behind Catherine Connolly demographically, I think, is a similar group of people, which is relatively young, disproportionately women, probably disproportionately kind of downwardly mobile. These like college educated or tend to be college educated young people. Like the media was like shocked that we had like a get out the vote rally with a load of great musicians in the final week, and we packed out a venue. It was a venue. It's quite a small venue. We had 1,500 people in it. We packed it out. Tickets were all sold in an hour. Like we could have packed something 10 times that size. Like we really could have. But all that stuff is kind of unprecedented in Irish politics. But the crowd there, like it was very much of that demographic. And you get the impression it's the same demographic which is driving those other factors. And it's these people who are, disproportionately involved and appalled at what's happening. And I think there's a big positive there. But there also is definitely a challenge to us. It's like our traditional electoral base as the radical left in Ireland would be in the kind of most hard pressed, most deprived working class communities. And while Catherine Connolly won in those areas in a massive way, there wasn't the same energy and the same level of volunteers and so on as there would be in some of the kind of more like kind of young renters. Do you know what I mean? Who are don't get me wrong, they're a vitally important group, but there is a certain gap opening up there, which is a challenge to us. And so you have very high rates of spoiled votes, which was linked to a campaign by the far right. Not everybody who's spoiling their vote is aware of that or whatever. Um, but there's a challenge that of like kind of trying to bridge that gap, trying to like fight the fight to keep the base in those hard pressed working class communities. These communities like they were the core of the water charges, a very powerful group of people. That we don't just become the parties and the left of these kind of downwardly mobile young people. Although inevitably they're going to make up a big chunk of your kind of active core. I think at this stage, and like it's a good thing. People are being radicalized, pushed to the left in horror at what's happening. But it just strikes me that there's a certain challenge there. And that's about what issues you campaign on, how you relate to people, into the future. But I do. I mean, I think the main lesson is like hope. You know, there's a point I made and I mean it genuinely at the first rally for Catherine Connolly. Is Catherine Connolly gives you hope. It's a very bleak world. For those of us who are eco-socialists, it's horrific. We have a world that is sliding deeper and deeper into barbarism, which is marked by the rise of the far right and anti-immigrant sentiment, war and genocide, and ecological catastrophe. And for those of us who know, it's just getting worse and worse and worse. Um, and then someone comes and gives you a bit of hope, and I think we should take hope from this. It's not over yet. We haven't lost definitively yet. There's lots of people. I think it's like for me, definitely in the context of like the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment has happened very quickly in Ireland, and it is depressing. There's like good working class people that I would have previously been connected to that Jesus have gone down terrible pipelines, pushed by the likes of Elon Musk and so on. Um, but it gives you a hope that actually the majority of people don't agree with that, don't like where the world is heading. And that's kind of a basic point I've made again and again. There's like many lessons of the Catherine Connolly campaign. The importance of movements. Catherine Connolly reflects as a part of the movements we've seen in recent periods in Ireland. She may have not have won without the movement on Gaza, which definitely meant that the smear tax on, oh, you're too critical of Western imperialism didn't work because people could see it. The left coming together. But like in a way, the most important thing is, well, no, people agree. Certainly in what they would like to see. People agree about housing. People agree about disability justice. People agree about the Irish language. People agree about neutrality. People agree on Gaza. In their hearts, most people agree with, broadly speaking, the values of the left. It doesn't mean that divide and rule isn't able to work. It doesn't mean that scaremongering isn't able to work on occasion. But like the majority of people do not like the way society and our world is going, and there's a lot to work with there and the potential to win victories.
So after this historic victory, what are the next steps for the left in Ireland?
The main thing we've been saying, and it gets a huge resonance from people, is like this movement doesn't stop now. This is not. And for Catherine Connolly, this was like when I spoke to her, like back at the very start of this, for her, this was all about trying to create a dynamic of unity on the left, which could pose the possibility of getting rid of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. There's a strategy here, and that doesn't stop now. And that point, like I spoke there was a final rally the night before the election in Galway, where Catherine is from, where the campaign was massive. And that point just got a huge resonance. They have this energy, they have the sense of being able to achieve something. They don't want that to go away. And they also know that winning the presidency is good, but like doesn't really change people's lives, Um, and it's interesting. There's a definite there's a huge energy and an interest for people in this. We as People for Profit organized a meeting, What's Next for the Left, on Monday gone, and we had it in a venue which is like 250, 300 people, and that's the sort of venue that like on a very important issue, with a lot of work, that hopefully we could fill that venue. But like again, like everything with linked to Catherine Connolly campaign, we put it online and all the tickets were gone within an hour, which is just like the thirst of people to discuss what's next, to find a way forward is really profound. And I think so far, certainly within the left, People for Profit has been pretty unique in, immediately on the day of the election, we had a press statement out, articles out saying this is what we think should happen next. And we that's not a ultimatum. We want to have a dialogue with others on the left, but we need to find a way forward together. So effectively, there's two parts to that from our perspective. One is in the here and now. We can't wait for the next elections. We have to try and work together to mobilize people to win things now for people. And the four key areas we've identified is defensive neutrality. So there's a key kind of legislative change they're trying to make to get rid of what's left of neutrality. We had an engagement yesterday with the Deputy Prime Minister, the Tánaiste, and they indicated again they're going to go for it before the end of the year, even though they've just lost on the presidential election and so on. So trying to mobilize people in defense of neutrality. On Gaza, on Palestine, ending Ireland's complicity, taking meaningful action against Israel. On the housing crisis, where there is a long-standing coalition with the trade unions, but it's been kind of moribund. Not a lot has happened. We need to try and mobilize people. In particular, well, partially because the far right have managed. Housing crisis has been going on well before the number of asylum seekers increased in here. But the far right has managed, with the assistance of the government, to try and make the housing crisis about immigration, which it's not about at all. It's about profiteering of landlords and developers and not investing in building public housing, basically. But we need to mobilize people on that. And on the cost of living crisis, which was a big issue in the election in the sense of the budget came in the middle of the election. The budget actively made people poorer. So it made, on average, people 2.5% poorer in terms of disposable income next year, made the lowest 10%, 4.5% poorer next year. So mobilize people on that. So yeah, we have ideas about United Front campaigns on these issues, using the dynamic of unity to try and mobilize people, give people confidence to now mobilize. People voted for certain values, now try and get people to mobilize for those values in their local communities and nationally. And then the second element is the question of elections, posing the possibility of a left government. And there's different parts of the left which emphasize kind of one or the other of those. And I think you really have to do both. If you just emphasize the left government element, you're like, that was kind of without the left bit, but that was kind of the mistake that Sinn Féin made between 2020 and 2024. They demobilized people, they created a vacuum for the far right to step into, and that political momentum, they thought political momentum was with them and it slipped away from them. You have to mobilize people in the here and now, give them a sense of their own power. But it would also be a mistake just to say mobilize people now. Like, people are engaged in the campaign because they want to see a fundamental change. They see that change is coming through a big change in government. So you need to relate to that and point the way forward for that as well. Even understanding that the next general election is likely to be 4 years away from now, so it's quite a distance. So in relation to that, we're immediately beginning the process of trying to have kind of bilateral discussions with the other parties, trying to move towards a situation of establishing a kind of liaison committee of the left parties where we can tease these things out over a period of time. We're putting forward the idea of a major assembly of the left, of parties and non-party people, to discuss these things in a kind of non-binding way, so no one feels, you're going to be bounced into this room and then you're going to be outvoted. They're different parties with their own democratic structures and rights, but let's at least have this discussion together and effectively see if we can get to a point. There's going to be, so Catherine was a TD, a member of Parliament. There now will be a by-election just for one seat in her area. Can we have a unified challenge in that campaign? So could we have one candidate supported by all the parties of the left, or at the very least, could we have a transfer pact between different candidates and parties of the left? That would be a step forward if we could achieve that. And then effectively building towards the next general election, can we have a coordinated challenge of the left, which most likely would find its expression the equivalent of a kind of new Popular Front in France in the Irish electoral system is a transfer pact. There are multi-seat constituencies. People don't need to stand aside for each other. You need a transfer pact to ensure that the votes are staying within the left as much as is possible. A transfer pact on the basis of commitment to broad left principles and on the basis of a commitment, not to vote for Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael to be Taoiseach and to vote for a left candidate to be Taoiseach. To be clear, like, all of that comes with complications from our perspective, particularly as kind of revolutionary socialists. The truth is that a government led by Sinn Féin, involving Social Democrats, Labour, and the Green Party, it's unlikely to be a government that challenges capitalism in a decisive way. It is a government that capitalism in Ireland would not be happy with and would be scared of. But these are parties that are not really making a commitment to challenge capitalism. But we think it would represent a certain turning of the page of politics, but on the agenda, class politics in a more definite way. And it's kind of, the idea that we can get rid of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, the idea that we can have a left government is something that is raising people's hopes, getting people into action, mobilizing people. We want to be connected to that. And then to say to people, fundamentally, if we want to resolve the housing crisis, the ecological crisis, the cost of living crisis, we need to actually challenge the economic system itself. We need a government that is willing to mobilize people from below to overcome the opposition of the capitalist class, the state, and have a fundamental eco-socialist transformation of society. And so for us as people before profit and presumably other parts of the radical left, we would not be entering a government, taking ministerial positions in a government that we feel is going to let people down, a government that does not commit to that sort of eco-socialist program. So you may well have a situation where if this goes well, you have an election of government, we would, as we have done actually after the last two elections, we vote for the Sinn Féin candidate for Taoiseach, for Prime Minister, but without taking up ministerial positions, and effectively, insofar as they implement the agreed broad left principles, the programme, we vote for every progressive reform, but we reserve the right to mobilise people from below against the government if they, break any of those promises, and to vote against the government if they implement, austerity measures, anti-immigrant measures, or whatever. So this is, not without its complications, but like in a choice of standing aside from this process or actually jumping in kind of head first, trying to lead this process. That's the truth. We're like trying to help create this dynamic. We want to be part of this dynamic while maintaining our political independence, while maintaining our own ideas and using it, in a mass way to try to say this is why we need really fundamental change in our society. Because obviously, like we know, like I made this point at a local meeting we had during the week, like I was in Greece when Syriza was elected. Like a left government in and of itself doesn't resolve people's problems, came under pressure from the Troika, obviously massive pressure, and then completely capitulated, sold people out and so on. And so, we're trying to build this broad movement for a left government, but within that trying to then make the argument for fundamental socialist change.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Green Left Show. Special thank you to our guest Paul Murphy for joining us this week. And we'll have an upcoming episode. We'll be discussing the Zoran Mamdani campaign with a member of the Democratic Socialists of America who has been involved in the campaign and is based in New York. So keep an eye on that. Make sure you subscribe and like this video to help us get boosted through the algorithms. And as I mentioned at the start, if you really liked this show and want to support the work that we're doing, head to greenleft.org.au/support. And become a supporter. It's only $5 a month. The cost of a cup of coffee or a beer, and it goes a long way to helping us continue to produce this content and the rest of the work that we do as well. But thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Green Left Show.